The story of the Pied Piper of Hamelin, or Der Rattenfänger von Hameln, as this figure is known in Germany, is, as Karl Zuckmayer once said, probably one of the most famous legends in the world, if not the most famous. It became known widely in the German-speaking world through the story Die Kinder zu Hameln, written by the Grimm brothers, Jakob and Wilhelm Grimm, in 1816. This story was part of a whole collection of fairy tales and stories that were supposed to give an indication of the great cultural wealth of German oral culture and folklore. On the English-speaking side, the story is most well known through the work The Pied Piper of Hamelin, a poem written by Robert Browning. He wrote it in 1842, and it appeared in volumes of his poetry somewhat later. The story, I think, is generally understood as having a very humorous side, almost light-hearted. And perhaps for that reason, Der Rattenfänger von Hameln, or the Pied Piper of Hamelin, is not considered to be the basis of any great work. Scholars of Browning would probably somewhat dismiss his poem about the Pied Piper. But as we shall see later, the story has some very serious, even very grim undertones. But before we come on to that subject, let me speak as one who has just visited Hamelin. Hamelin, or Hameln, is on the River Weser, not so far from Hanover. It's situated in some very delightful countryside with castles and other sites of interest. The town itself is certainly worth seeing as a place of great architectural interest. The houses that one sees there are generally in the so-called Weser Renaissance style, which can be easily identified through its gables and some of the bay windows which protrude from the facade. In fact, one such house is the so-called Rattenfänger house. The facade dates from 1602, but it is situated next to the so-called Bungenlose Straße, down which the Pied Piper, according to tradition, led the children before he left the town through the eastern gate. And even to this day, music should not be played in that street in remembrance of the children who were led away, never to be seen again. The town of Hamelin in the 13th century had been, one might say, a base for a church mission to Germany, a fact that is indicated by the very name of the church, St. Boniface, who of course was the Anglo-Saxon missionary who did so much to evangelize central Germany. In the course of the 13th century, the town of Hamelin lost its very strong church connections and came under secular influences. And that's true also of a town in the immediate vicinity called Koppenbrugge, where the so-called Spiegelberg family became established. And that's very important as regards the story of the Pied Piper, because those who've done research in the story, I have identified Niklaus von Spiegelberg with the Pied Piper. One very leading scholar in this field, Hans Doverton, suggests that the Count Niklaus von Spiegelberg was interested in inducing people, young people particularly, to emigrate to the eastern reaches of the German-speaking world, to colonize what is now Pomerania or areas close to the North Sea. According to Hans Doverton, Niklaus von Spiegelberg took 130 young people or children to Stettin, and after that embarked on a voyage which ended in tragedy. And he interprets the tragic loss of the children in terms of their being drowned in the North Sea. But there is another theory which I will discuss a bit later. Let's now return to the town of Hamelin as we find it today as a tourist. Of course, the town fully exploits the legend. This little memento is just one indication of the trivial tourist foibles that one can buy there. Of course, the town also cashes in on the story itself by presenting a play every Sunday in the summer season, and also allowing a musical to be staged, and this is called Rats. The original version of this musical was in fact composed by a person who wrote English, but it's been translated into German and other languages. And I think one could say that the version of the story that the Grimm brothers formulated is clearly shown in the play, while the musical has many elements that I think go back to Robert Browning's version of the story. For example, in Robert Browning's poem, the rats become like people. They have a voice. There is the one rat who escaped to Ratland and was able to give a glowing account of the wonderful consumerist paradise that awaited the rats under the influence of the Piper's music. And in the musical, the Rat King is a leader of his own people, in this case the rats, in some ways very similar to the Pied Piper. And he leads them to some great paradise that he promises beyond the Weser. The music of this musical reminds me a little of contemporary music, pop music, one or two marching songs that go back to the American Civil War. But it does obviously have a very light-hearted tone which appeals to the many tourists who see it on Wednesday. The question is, what underlies this legend? It may come as a surprise when I say that the earliest version of the story may have had absolutely no reference to rats whatsoever. Here I quote it in the original Low German. You can see it for yourselves if you wish, but I would translate it as follows. In the year 1284, on the day of John and Paul, which was the 26th of June, by means of a piper dressed in motley colours, 130 children were led away, or possibly seduced, and were led to Calvary next to Koppen, where they were lost. As I said, absolutely no mention of rats, and yet somehow this story is very specific. Why should it mention a particular day, a saint's day, a particular year, an exact number of children, and specify a certain place with a name, Calvary, which of course reminds us of Calvary in the New Testament, What about Koppen, though? What might that be? Here we will come on to a question of great interest, debated by the scholars who have concerned themselves with this story. I think we have to mention here how such stories as that of the Pied Piper evolve. They have a certain kind of organic consistency. They grow, perhaps they unite with other legends in terms of some kind of cross-fertilization. At some stage or other then, the story of the rats got connected with that of a piper who led away 130 children on a certain saint's day. And, of course, there are many versions of the Pied Piper story, beginning possibly in 1380, if not earlier, and running right through up to the present time. Let us take the version which Browning based his story on. He gives a different year as that when the Pied Piper appeared, and even a different date. In his case, it is the 22nd of July in 1376. And that, in fact, goes back to an earlier version which identified the happening of the Pied Piper with another saint's day, not the 26th of June, but the 22nd of July, which is the saint's day dedicated to Mary Magdalene. But here we see a certain consistency. Okay, it wasn't the same date exactly, but it was another saint's day. And to give this a very negative complexion, a French author by the name of Prosper Mérimée included the story in a novel he wrote about what happened in the reign of Charles IX, the King of France. And the story tells how a group of mercenary soldiers on their way to Paris heard the story from the mouth of a young gypsy girl. And here the piper, in fact, is identified with none less than the devil. And what happens subsequently when they get to Paris? They witness the massacre of the Huguenots, which occurred, strangely enough, on a saint's day, on the eve of St. Bartholomew. And so it would appear that, perhaps by intuition, if not by close study, an author well removed from the time of the origin of this story saw some kind of connection, some kind of continuity. We cannot say, referring to the devil now, that the original story definitely identified the piper with any figure of evil. It's extremely ambivalent. It says that the children were lost. One might interpret that on a very literal level, that they were never seen again. It might possibly mean that they suffered some tragedy, such as this shipwreck. Maybe that they were lost souls in a more theological sense. And again, we see a general movement in the evolution of the story away from this very ambivalent but relatively morally neutral position to one in which the Pied Piper became demonized. Most specifically in the middle of the 16th century, where he is identified, without any question at all, with the devil. And then, shortly after this, about 10 years after that, in 1560, another version of the story connects the piper story with the rat story. There are many stories about magicians, musicians, who have used their powers to rid places of vermin, be it rats or mice or whatever. But then, interestingly enough, some new fiction had to be brought in to connect the stories. And that, of course, found its expression in the contract made between the piper and the town of Hamelin. He came to the town, he realized how terrible the situation was. He made a commercial offer, which was quite simply, I can get rid of the rats for a certain sum of money, which had to be agreed on, a contract. And the town elders accepted this. He got rid of the rats, but then they, that is the elders of the town, ratted on him. They reneged on their commitment, and he took appropriate action from his point of view. And so the fact that the piper was cheated militates against the whole question of whether he can be identified with evil per se, and the town people were his victims because they themselves had contributed to this sad event. And we see, I think we can relate this question of money and contracts to the situation in Europe, particularly in Germany, in the latter half of the 16th century. We mustn't forget there had been terrible unrest, social unrest. And in fact, at the beginning of that century, or the end of the 15th century, a figure known as the Piper of Niklashausen, Pfeifer von Niklashausen, instigated a rebellion among the peasantry against the prevailing social system. Again, why was he a piper? As though the use of music had some kind of subversive political effect. And I personally would argue that the whole story, as it's gelled in the 16th century, expresses misgivings not so much against heretics as against people fomenting social unrest at a time when the old feudal system was dissolving and capitalism was on the rise. And then, what about Browning's version? Interestingly enough, a psychologist, a person interested in depth psychology and perhaps developing the theories of Jung, the great founder of a certain branch of modern psychological theory, said, in fact, that the piper, far from being the devil, is a representation of Jesus Christ. And I think it's pretty clear that though he wrote his article in Italian, he refers very much to the text of Brownings' poem, where the piper plays three notes. Could this be an allusion to the Trinity, as this psychologist thinks, or could it be a reference to the 3 days, the time of the resurrection? And there are other indications that one can find from a very close reading of the text that at least indicates that Browning associated the Pied Piper more with Jesus than with the devil, but not on a purely religious basis. I think he associated the artist, the musician, the poet, very much with the divine, the sublime. And we note that also from his other works. So we see this story has a great deal of depth to it that expresses itself on the surface in certain metaphors, but obviously there is some very close connection between the piper and some great mystic power, be this good or evil, or perhaps the relationship of both good and evil, which I think is the most likely, the most promising avenue of interpretation. In fact, it's interesting to note how the story evolved up to the point when rats entered the story. I was visiting Hamelin a couple of months back. I was reading the very, very long and detailed compilation of the versions of the story by Hans Doverton in the town archives. I came across his theory that the Pied Piper was in fact Niklaus von Spiegelberg, the reference to Koppen being an allusion to some tragedy at sea. But I had noticed that there was a town in the immediate neighborhood called Koppenbrugge. Koppen again. Could that have some connection with Koppen, Koppelberg, as known to those who read the early versions of the Piper story? So on the spur of the moment, rather late in the day in fact, I took the train to this place, Koppenbrugge, not knowing even if I could stay the night, on a hunch that perhaps something interesting could be discovered there. And it was getting dark, and I noticed some dark mountain looming, or high hill, looming on the horizon. I kind of sensed, could that be Koppelberg? Fortunately, I did find a hotel, Hotel zum Ith, ITH, and I arranged to stay the night. And at the bar there was only one person who frequented the bar at that time, a certain man of about 50, and he soon noted my interest in the Pied Piper, and his eyes glowed with some kind of intense interest. And he produced from somewhere in that room some booklets explaining that, in fact, according to a current theory, Koppenberg was in fact that very hill that I had seen. It is no longer known as Koppenberg, but as the Ittberg, which, by the way, this Ittberg still has many romantic associations, a kind of Never Never Land to which songs in the musical Rats referred. And he said that he was personally convinced that the Pied Piper, in fact Niklaus von Spiegelberg, who established a very strong authority in that town, led the 130 children to Koppenbrugge. Not only there, but led them up, some way up this hill, where it became extremely rocky and cavernous, and that some terrible misfortune befell the 130 young persons. This could have been some kind of geological shift, an earthquake, or more probably, they were led to their death. Why should that be? Well, the theory goes that this mountain area was used by those who performed certain unconventional, unorthodox rites going back to pre-Christian times. One might say nature worshippers, whatever. And it apparently paid Spiegelberg to eliminate this source of trouble by a very radical and brutal means. A few days later, I in fact went up this hill and saw some of the sites where this event could have taken place. And I must admit it was a very eerie kind of scenario. And the director of the museum in Koppenbrugge, a certain Gernot Husam, has written a very scholarly work on arguments why the thesis I've just proposed is valid. And he can adduce evidence showing that earlier this hill was in fact known as Koppenberg, and he goes further into the history of that period, and far from stating that Niklaus von Spiegelberg died at sea in some distant place, that because he'd become involved in a very bad, violent act, he had to leave the scene. I'm not saying which theory can be proved, but it seems to me more plausible that the source of the story should refer to a place in the immediate vicinity of Hamelin, because that exactly is what the story originally says, that he led them from the east gate eastwards to a certain place within walking distance, evidently. There is, in fact, a picture of the place to which the Pied Piper led the children, and I think it's interesting to have a look at this picture. The picture, which I think is a very interesting source of evidence, was made by a certain Augustin von Mörsperg from Alsace, who traveled around parts of Europe making pictures and doing a great deal of historical research. And I think this picture does indicate the depth of research he must have engaged in. The picture dates from the year 1592. If we look at it closely, we see 3 stags, 3 deer, and 3 deer were, the emblems of 3 deer were in the coat of arms of the house of Spiegelberg, the Counts Spiegelberg, this dynasty that established itself in Koppenbrugge way back in the 13th century and continued for centuries further. We also see the path along which the children were led, leading from the east gate of the city or the town of Hamelin, in accordance with tradition. The path they took leads to a place of execution. We see gallows and a wheel, an instrument of torture. And that would correspond to the idea put forward in a number of documents that Calvary was in fact a place of execution, where the gallows would have stood. Another aspect of the concept Calvary in the Middle Ages was that it represented a skull. One might think here of Golgotha in Hebrew, the place of Christ's crucifixion. But to the medieval mind it symbolized the gaping jaws of hell into which sinners, particularly heretics and the worst offenders against the medieval church, would have been swallowed, indicating that, shall we say, official guardians of the church would have regarded the Pied Piper as some kind of leader of unchristian people, possibly heretics. And then Where does the piper lead the children? To some kind of rocky face, some cave, which accords well with the topography in the upper reaches of the It, or what was earlier the Koppelberg. Interestingly enough, some of the stones and rocks in the upper reaches of this hill or mountain show evidence that they were carved so as to appear as faces, human faces and animal faces, sometimes with an animal, could be a ram, emerging from the mouth of the larger figure, and other smaller faces appearing at various points in the rock. And there is evidence to show that such sites proliferate in Europe, going back to a time just after the glacial retreat when certain populations of that time made their monuments, their memorials to whatever they believed in, one being a face with a blind eye and a seeing eye, where the blind eye indicated an inner vision, one eye looking into the outer world, one looking into the inner soul. And this being the case, one sees why the site would have accumulated such an attraction, or such powers of attraction to those looking back to earlier belief systems. So, I would personally opt for the option that Koppenberg was this local site for various reasons, for reasons I've indicated, but I would invite anyone listening or watching to do their own research. At the end, there will be a bibliography of the sources to which I've referred and other sources, and one can then be part of a very extended and interesting historical debate, but one which also broadens out into a whole discussion of art, the relationship between arts and human condition, social conditions, perhaps even the greatest existential questions that humanity faces, those dealt with by Shakespeare and other great writers, who have not passed over the story of the Pied Piper. Certainly Goethe wrote his version in which he shows that the Pied Piper, first of all, led the rats away to their destruction, led children away to some unspecified spot. So far he accords with tradition. But a third category of person led away by the Pied Piper is that of young girls and women, pointing, I think, to the, I wouldn't say erotic, but in the wider sense, social, sexual implications of this story, that we might relate to certain psychological theories speaking of the libido and its quest for fulfillment in the mother, in the lover. And interestingly enough, at the time of the vernal equinox, the sun rises just over the Itberg east of Hamelin. Could that be some indication of its wide appeal to the human psyche, and with all its interesting psychological and even sexual ramifications? And one more recent version of the story was written by the French poet Apollinaire, and he creates a figure very much like the piper, and the people who follow him are only women, and he leads them away to some place where they altogether vanish. And so we find this story recurring in the most unexpected places. If we read Dylan Thomas's famous poem Fern Hill, time leads the children out of grace in all his tuneful turnings. For me, this is a very, very clear indication of an allusion to the Pied Piper. In fact, it was this poem that got me interested in this theme many years ago. And a number of my friends, I myself even, have tried to render it in our own terms, and perhaps we can go on from here to show how we would transpose and translate this legend into music, poetry, and art generally. Thank you for your interest.